Hey everyone, welcome to a text prep. Excuse me. Welcome to a text prep video of Psalm 139. I hope that as we work our way through it with a bit more of an analytical eye, that it will be helpful for you as you continue to meditate on this, and that it will be helpful for others as you dig in a bit more in your MCs this week and in future conversations with others as well. The basic plan for today is to make some structural markers to show where the psalm is divided up, and then we'll notice some common themes in those subsections as they help us to understand this psalm and what it means a little bit better. So without any further ado, the first major obvious marker in the psalm lies here between verse 18 and 19. It's not ideal that it's in 3 columns, it's just a long psalm. But it lies here between verse 18 and verse 19. This is such an obvious marker in the psalm that many interpreters of the psalm have really struggled with making sense of how it fits and why it fits, and even if it fits. Some have suggested that it was a later addition by a later editor, and that the original psalm was just 1 to 18. Others have suggested that this ending section of 19 onwards, excuse me, should rather be the start of Psalm 140, not the end of 139. Our security lies in the fact that there are themes which occur of searching and knowing and testing, and the psalmist's heart here, which clearly connected to the rest of the psalm, searching, knowing, perceiving, the inmost being of the psalmist in verse 13. There are such clear links between verse 19 to 24 with the rest of the psalm that we can very confidently say it's not a mistake that it's here. It doesn't belong anywhere else. In fact, it being there helps us to make more sense of what's going on in 1 to 18. And so the most obvious first marker lies there between 18 and 19, simply because it seems so left field. It seems to come entirely out of nowhere. So our first section is 1 to 18. Our second section is 19 to 24. The first section can really be split into 3 major subsections with the conclusion. You've got 1 to 6, which starts us off where the psalmist is really reflecting on God knowing him through and through. If you just look at the verbs which come up, particularly the ones used of God, it's all about him knowing, him perceiving, him searching, him being familiar. The psalmist reflects verse 6 that such knowledge is just too wonderful for him, too lofty for him to attain. God is the one who knows him completely through and through. And the reason that God knows him completely, well, there's actually 2 reasons. And that's the remainder 2 sections of this first chunk. Verse 7 to 12 and verse 13 to 16. The first reason that God really knows him so well is that God is always with him. God's presence and spirit is inescapable. Where can I go from your spirit, he says? Where can I flee from your presence? In the heavens, God is there. In the depths, God is there. If he rises on the wings of the dawn, if he settles on the far side of the sea, even there, God's hand is and will guide him. He cannot go far enough to escape God's presence, and he cannot even go dark enough to hide. Verse 11, surely the darkness will hide me, he says, and light will become as night around me, but even darkness will not be dark to you, he says. He cannot go far enough, he cannot go dark enough to get away from God's presence and escape God being there with him. That's the first reason that God knows him so well, is because God is always with him. The second reason that God knows him so well, verse 13 to 16, is that God has created him entirely and knit him together. God has made him, God has designed him. Nothing was hidden from God in a secret place. God's the one who wove him together, and even his eyes saw his unformed body. The picture that the psalmist is trying to create here is really one of God not just being a builder, but God being an intricate designer, knitting together, weaving together, and doing that to or for the psalmist's inmost being. It's interesting the language that comes up here of the internals of a man, of a human being. The mother's womb, the secret place, his inner being, his frame. This is a metaphorical way of saying his bones. In the depths of the earth, it really carries this picture of the inwardness. And this is significant because the psalmist is reflecting on the fact that God doesn't only know him in terms of his actions and his whereabouts, but God actually knows his internals. The word translated as inmost being is the Hebrew word for kidneys. The kidneys had a figurative connotation to it as being the seat of the human conscience and perhaps affections and emotions as well. That's significant because the psalmist says God knits together his inner workings. Even the inner workings of his conscience, his emotions and desires and affections, God is the one who's absolutely in control of even those, not only his outer actions. And these two parts of God always being present and God knowing and designing his inward being really play into the fact that he is absolutely and completely known by God, verse 1 to 6. I want you to see that there's a strong personal element to what the psalmist is saying here. The psalmist isn't just generally reflecting upon the fact that God knows all things and that God is present everywhere and that God created everything. But the psalmist is reflecting on those three themes incredibly personally. God doesn't just know all things, but God knows him. Notice the first person pronouns which come up from verse 1 to 18. God isn't just present everywhere, but he is present with him. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee? If I go to the heavens, you are there. And God didn't just create all things, but God created him, my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I've just highlighted a few of them, but you can really work your way through here and you'd be astounded by the amount of first-person pronouns which are coming up here. God intimately and personally knows the psalmist so well because he is always with him and because he created him even to his innermost parts. Verse 17 and 18 really function as the conclusion to this first section as these themes come up again of God knowing all things and God being present with him always. The psalmist really revels in this fact. How precious are your thoughts to me? How vast is the sum of them? I can't even count them. The psalmist celebrates the fact that God knows him so well. The big question is, how does this connect to the last section of the psalm, verse 19 to 24. Because it really can seem like it's coming from out of nowhere. He's got this glorious celebration of God's knowledge of him. And then he moves verse 19. If only, God, you would slay the wicked. Away from me, you who are bloodthirsty. These people are really the characters of verse 19 to 22. The wicked, the bloodthirsty, those who have evil intent, the adversaries who misuse the Lord's name, those who are in rebellion against him. He considers them his enemies. These are the main characters of this last section, and this really helps us to make sense of the rest of the psalm. The question that we need to ask is, why does the psalmist feel so threatened by them? He obviously does feel threatened by them. He wants God to slay them, and he wants them to be away from him. But why is it? What is the threat that he is facing, which causes him to recall God's all-knowingness, verse 1 to 18? The thing which will help us to make sense of exactly what could be the threat, well, there's really two things which point us in some kind of a direction. The first thing is that the psalmist seems to be making a personal defense of himself here. Verse 21, he says, "Don't I hate those who hate you, Lord, and abhor those who are in rebellion against you?" Now, what's significant here is that he uses a rhetorical question. Don't I, he says in verse 21, hate those? Don't I abhor those? Now, we do this all the time to make personal defenses of ourselves when we stand face to face with an accusation that's been made of us. Don't I always drink milk in my coffee? You'd say to someone who's lodged the complaint against you that you never drink milk in your coffee. You use the rhetorical question as a personal defense. Don't I always? Don't I hate those who hate you, Lord? Don't I abhor those who are in rebellion against you? He's making a defense of himself there. The second reason, the second thing which helps us make sense a little bit of the threat of the adversaries here is just the language that the psalmist has used in the rest of the psalm. If you just throw your eye over some of the green highlighted parts from verse 1 to 6, those are all vindication language that's being used. Search me, know me, perceive, discern. This is language which is used to search and to test. And the psalmist will actually say that a little bit later, verse 23 and 24. Search me, know me, and test me. And this is all language which is used to vindicate someone, to know and test and search someone's heart and their motives. And so the most probable explanation of the psalmist's threat here is that he is standing accused. He's standing accused and criticized of things, and he feels as though he is innocent. And so he makes a personal defense of himself, verse 21, and he recounts God being the one who ultimately knows and who ultimately searches. What is the accusation that's been made against him? It's unclear. We could guess and we could extrapolate from the fact that he personally defends himself as hating the wicked, that perhaps the accusation against him is that he doesn't. Perhaps the accusation against him is that he loves wickedness, or he walks in the way of wickedness. And he is defending himself, saying he doesn't. He hates those who are in rebellion against God. He hates wickedness. He abhors them. He has nothing but hatred for them, verse 22. He counts them as his enemies. Perhaps his personal defense reveals to us what the accusation is. And it's really in light of this accusation in light of his accusers, that he asks God, verse 23 and verse 24, to search him and to know him. And it's really this final section which is the moment to which the entire psalm is working. The psalmist has recalled that God is the one who knows all things, who is always present with him, who created him. And so it makes sense that he would ask God to know him and search him and test him. No one else is really better qualified to do this for him. Search him, to know him, and to test him. What is interesting here is that the psalmist asks God to do this, even though, verse 21 and 22, he feels as though he is innocent. He's already made proof for his case. He's set forward the evidence. But despite his certainty about what's going on in his own heart, he still feels that he needs to approach God and ask God to search him and to know him and to test him. What's further interesting is that the psalmist doesn't only want God to search him in case the accusations are true, but the psalmist actually wants God to see that if there is an offensive way in him, that God would lead him in the way everlasting. The psalmist is not just content with God knowing the depths of his heart. The psalmist isn't just content with him coming to know whether he's really at fault here, whether these accusations are true. The psalmist wants God to lead him in the way everlasting. This makes sense of the fact that the psalmist recalls what he does in 1 to 18. God is the one who can ultimately correct him. God is the one who can ultimately search him, because God is the one who knows him through and through. And so as he stands in the face of his enemies, those who are accusing him, God is the one who'd be able to help him, to not only search him, but to lead him in the correct way. This radically changes the way, excuse me, in which we face criticism. Criticism is something that we face regularly, and it's something that we should expect to face regularly. We are not perfect, and other people are not perfect. Sin exists in this world, and criticism is a reality because of that. Sometimes you might feel innocent, fair enough. Sometimes you might not. We can pray this prayer, we can say these words to God, and we can learn some important truths from the psalm, which are particularly emboldened and beautified through the lens of Jesus as you and I face criticisms today. And those three things are this. We can run through them very quickly. The first is this, that God knows you and I better than anyone else knows us. In Christ, he knows us even better because he became a man. He's able to empathize with us because he's walked in our shoes. For that reason, there's no one better to search your heart and to know you and to test you, even if you feel innocent. The second thing that we learn from the psalmist is that he's got the courage to approach God in the first place and say, search and know me, without fear of what God's going to find. We have even more courage to do that in Jesus. We do not need to fear what God will find when he searches our heart. We do not need to fear destruction or abandonment, because Christ was destroyed and abandoned on our behalf. And so we can approach the throne with confidence, knowing that he will search and test us and that we won't be destroyed. And finally, we approach him not just wanting to know what's wrong with our hearts, but wanting him to change us. Verse 24, God won't only be able to see if there is an offensive way in you, but He'll be able to lead you in a way everlasting. And in Christ, He has given us His Spirit to change us more and more into the image of His Son. And so sometimes we will face criticism, and the temptation will be to brush it aside or to say that it's not true. It's a brave prayer to ask God to search us and to know us in the face of those criticisms, and to ask Him to lead us in the way everlasting, to change us, to make us different, to make us more like Jesus. I hope the psalm, as we've looked at with a bit more of a critical eye, has been helpful. I hope it will be fruitful in your conversations this week. And I hope that this will radically change the way in which you look at your own heart and in which you pour that out before Jesus. Have a good week.